But it does seem that an agenda of people writing this literature is to shame conservative Christians, to make it seem inappropriate for them to bring their faith into the public square, to argue for things like restrictions on abortion or for robust understanding of religious liberty or for school vouchers, just to name three issues. This is illegitimate Christian nationalism. You can't do that, right? That's un-American.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saroof. I'm joined today by our longtime friend at ISI, Mark David Hall, who is a professor at Regent University's Robertson School of Government, as well as the director of Religious Liberty in the States and a senior research fellow at the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. Mark has written, edited, or co-edited 15 books, including most recently, and the subject of our talk today, Who's Afraid of Christian Nationalism? Why Christian Nationalism is Not an Existential Threat to America or the Church. Congratulations on the book, Mark.
Thanks so much, Tom.
First question for you is, why write this book? What is animating our discussions and the sort of national conversation today, and in your own research, scholarly work, and interests, and maybe, conversation partners that inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So most of my work has been on the American founding, or maybe more broadly, religious liberty and church-state relations throughout all of American history. But on January 6, 2021, I was flying home from a speaking engagement, and on the layover, I got an email from a reporter asking for comments on the Christian images among the Capitol Hill rioters. And this is the first I'd heard of the Capitol Hill riots. So I said, yeah, I'll be happy to comment. I'm horrified by the event, but I'd be happy to comment on the Christian images. It took her about 20 minutes to get those to me. So as I was waiting, I went through as much of the footage as I could find. And what I saw among the rioters were a sea of American flags, a sea of Trump flags, tons of MAGA hats, and no Christian images. And so I was kind of curious. Eventually, the reporter sent me 5 images. Several of them were indeed Christian images, but they were literally 1.5 miles away from the U.S. Capitol building. You know this because Washington Monument's directly in the backdrop, and the Washington Monument's 1.5 miles from the U.S. Capitol. Among the rioters, there was one Pine State flag. This is a yellow flag with a green evergreen that has the words, "An appeal to heaven." Well, those words could be from Judges, the book of Judges, but they could also be from John Locke's second treatise on government. And perhaps a person brought a Revolutionary era flag because he thought he was engaged in a second American Revolution or something like that. So it's not all that evident that this is a Christian image. And then finally, there was a crazy-looking goth guy holding what is clearly a copy of the Bible, standing in front of the rioters. And so I cautioned the reporter. I said, you might want to be careful with this narrative you seem to be crafting. She completely ignored me, came out the next day with the story, Christian nationalists have attacked the U.S. Capitol building. And in the story, like so many of these stories, she cites Samuel Perry, the sociologist, as saying the attack on January 6th was as Christian nationalist as it gets. And I had probably heard that phrase before, but I really hadn't thought much of it. And so I started doing research. I started literally reading every book, every article I could find on American Christian nationalism. And what you find is that no one in America is calling himself or herself a Christian nationalist, maybe with a few odd exceptions. Really, until 2022, nobody's talking about Christian nationalism as a phenomenon prior to 2006. It's beginning in 2006 where we begin to get a steady stream of books, mostly by activists and journalists and polemical activists again, who are decrying this great movement of American Christians who want to take over America for Christ, conflate God and country, and then literally oppress everyone except for white Christian males. And most of this literature was simply ridiculous, just based on assertions and rhetoric and guesswork. But about 2019, academics, I suppose before then you had academics who had been doing some work in the academic journal literature, but academics began to publish on this phenomenon, attempting to measure it and attempting to define it a little bit more better. I think here of people like Whitehead and Perry, Taking America Back for God. And so I started reading this literature as well. This was better. It's not as polemical. It's not as alarmist, but it was still profoundly flawed in what seemed to me to be obvious ways. And so all of this inspired me to write a book on American Christian nationalism, the first two chapters of which take on all of this critical literature.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Gotcha. Yeah, it sounds, as you're speaking, especially with the polemical writers, that they're political activists engaging in a smear campaign of sorts. And so I'd be curious to hear how they're describing what Christian nationalism is in greater detail, and then also what your recommendations to conservative Christians who would, be likely to be on the receiving end of, you support, prayer in public schools or something, some policy that's, and then on abortion or codifying marriage between one man and one woman in law. And you say, oh, that's Christian nationalist rhetoric, and that's scary and, a threat to democracy. Conservative Christians would be likely to be on the receiving end of this. What is your recommendation for opposing this sort of smear? How do we avoid that or counter it?
Yes, I think you're right. I think I hesitate to impute motives, but it does seem that an agenda of people writing this literature is to shame conservative Christians, to make it seem inappropriate for them to bring their faith into the public square, to argue for things like restrictions on abortion or for robust understanding of religious liberty or for school vouchers, just to name three issues. This is illegitimate Christian nationalism. You can't do that, right? That's un-American. And this becomes evident when you read this literature and you see, lo and behold, even the critics, especially the critics, maybe love the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And they say, look, this is laudable. Christian activism is just this other stuff we don't like. So basically the stuff we disfavor is Christian nationalism. The stuff we like is great, laudable Christian activism. So just a general piece of advice would be to keep an open mind when you're reading through critical literature like this, and just ask yourself, do the claims of these authors seem plausible? Are they making arguments? Are they relying upon evidence? Or do they just seem to be guessing at things? And so some of the fun claims of the Christian nationalist, the critics of Christian nationalism, they usually argue that the Christian nationalist movement came out of the ashes of the old religious right. And each and every one of them say that the religious right was founded in the late 1970s to protect white segregated academies, or to protect Bob Jones University, which prohibited interracial dating. And sure enough, that makes it sound like, well, the religious right was founded for racist reasons, and then therefore this must carry on to the Christian nationalist movement. But if you just step back and think about it for half a second, even if you aren't a historian, even if you aren't a scholar, almost everyone who writes about the religious right understands that it was formed for a wide variety of reasons, right? It came out of the groups opposing the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first passed by Congress in 1973. It came out of a movement to return prayer to public schools. That was a result of the school prayer decisions in 1962 and 1963. It came out of a concern for what was going on in public schools, sex education, and this sort of thing. So there's a whole constellation of issues. And although too many white segregated academies were founded in the American South in the 50s and 60s after Brown versus School Board, these had mostly faded by the mid-70s. And so to attribute the rise of the religious right to protecting white segregated academies, that's just a ridiculous claim on the face of it. And so, as you're reading along and see this sort of thing, you should probably say, oh, really? What's the evidence for this? Another of my favorite claims is that Rousas Rushdoony is an intellectual godfather of the Christian nationalist movement. Now, you've probably heard of Rushdoony. When I give this talk, a talk based on what I'm saying now before an audience of 150 people, maybe 2 people would have even heard of Rushdoony. He's a well-known quirky Calvinist in certain narrow Calvinist circles, but otherwise the guy had almost no influence. And yet every one of the critics of Christian nationalism attribute great influence to him because he does in fact argue for some kind of scary things. He argues for the reinstatement of Old Testament law, which would do things like require men who engage in homosexual activity to be stoned to death, or it would require adulterers to be stoned to death. Well, that does sound kind of scary, right? So they want to attribute the views of Rushdoony to the current contemporary Christian nationalists, and therefore we should be really afraid because we're heading towards theocracy. Just ridiculous literature. So yeah, I think familiarize yourself with it. And if someone calls you a Christian nationalist, say, what do you mean by that? And well, you obviously are influenced by Rushdoony. And you could say, well, no, I'm not. I've never even heard of the guy, right? And try to get them to define what they're talking about, and then give reasons to believe that you or I are a Christian nationalist. And hopefully we could, what I'd be happy to do is just get away from labeling altogether. And you can disagree with me on the sanctity of human life and the extent to which it should be protected by law. Let's have a reasonable discussion about that based on medical evidence and shared morality. There's no need for you to just simply label me a Christian nationalist and try to dismiss me from public discourse.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because even if it is Christian nationalism, so what? Abortion shouldn't be legal, or whatever the thing may be. So that smear, if you're repellent to it or immune to it, doesn't even really work either. But what do you mean? What do you mean by Christian nationalism? Because the polemicists, maybe you're using it as a smear. They want to tie it to stoning people, or some sort of racism and sexism. How do you define Christian nationalism as you were seeing it, or responding to those criticisms?
Yeah, before I get there, Tom, let me turn real quickly to the academics who write on it, because they offer a very similar definition to that of the polemical critics. So Whitehead and Perry, for instance, describe Christian nationalism as a conflation of God and country that's mixed in a toxic stew of racism, sexism, homophobism, militarism, a divine sanction for the use of force. And so they paint a similarly scary phenomenon. What becomes, again, ridiculous, and it should, even if you aren't a social scientist, as you read through their study, and you find that they're claiming 51.9% of Americans fully or partially embrace this toxic stew, and then just ask yourself, really? So of the people I go to church with, this means almost all of them would have to be Christian nationalists, because a lot of people aren't even going to church, right? Does it really seem to me that this is the case? And I think almost right away you would say, yeah, there are people here who want to return prayer to public school, and maybe I disagree with that, maybe I don't. There's a flag up by the altar. That seems a little inappropriate in a church, but these people are not racist. They aren't sexist. They're not homophobic. They might be against homosexual activity, believing it to be unbiblical, but they don't want to throw homosexuals in jail or that sort of thing. They certainly aren't militarists. And so to just step back and think about it for a minute. And then when you look at Whitehead and Perry's study, they use responses to 6 statements to judge whether you're a Christian nationalist or not. If you strongly agree with the statement, you get 4 points. If you strongly disagree, you get 0 points. But all of these statements are really not getting at the phenomenon they purport to measure, except for one, the very first one. Congress should declare America to be a Christian nation. And that certainly does favor Christianity over other religions. 3 of the statements get at the strict separation of church and state. Do you favor the strict separation of church and state? Now, in answering that, we have to remember that separationists believe, for instance, that a 1925 cross now on public land in Maryland must be torn down because it violates a wall of separation between church and state, or that school vouchers must be prohibited because they violate the separation of church and state, or that religious prisoners ought not to be specially protected if they have to do things for religious reasons because this violates a wall of separation between church and state. One question involves whether or not prayer should be allowed in public schools. Now think about it for a minute. If prayer was not allowed in public schools, what are we going to do? Have teachers stopping Susie from praying over her math test, or Johnny from praying over his lunch, or Islamic students who need to pray at particular times during the day? Are we going to stop them from praying? I think most sensible people would say, of course, voluntary student prayer should be allowed in public schools. What we don't want, at least many of us don't want, are teacher-led prayers in public schools, but that's not what the question asked. So by the time you get done with all these questions, you can see how up to 51.9% of Americans overall are fully or partially in support of these sorts of things. Something like 80% of African Americans are as well. But this is not embrace. It's not the same thing as embracing a toxic stew of racism, sexism, militarism, and that sort of thing. So pretty much everyone is defining Christian nationalism as a horrible, scary phenomenon. You asked specifically about how I define it, and I do have a chapter where I lay out my definition. I lay out some survey research that gets at measuring this phenomenon. I define Christian nationalism as a view that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that therefore today Christianity should be specially favored by the state and federal government. And so you can get at this. You do find survey research shows that about 20% of Americans do believe America was founded as a Christian nation. About 18% believe that Congress should declare America to be a Christian country. About 28% believe that public school teachers should lead children in distinctively Christian prayers. And so all of these things, I think, do involve something recently called Christian nationalism. I'd point out a lot of this is fairly benign stuff. If Congress were to declare America to be a Christian country, who cares? Who would be hurt by this? Yeah, I know some people would be put off by it, but it's not really hurting anyone any more than it hurts people to have "In God We Trust" on our money or "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. Currently, every state constitution references a deity, and in the context in which these constitutions were written, it clearly is referencing the Christian deity, and yet no one is really materially harmed by this reality. I think teacher-led prayer in public schools is a bad idea, but let's say in some crazy universe we return to that, and I don't even think that's remotely possible. If we did, presumably students who didn't want to participate wouldn't be forced to participate, just as teachers today lead students in the Pledge of Allegiance. But if students don't want to participate, as Jehovah's Witness students don't, they aren't forced to. So again, this would be off-putting. It would maybe make some people feel uncomfortable, but we're hardly returning to the days of Jim Crow legislation, women being barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen and not being able to vote and that sort of thing. But with all that said, I give what I think are good constitutional reasons, prudential reasons, biblical reasons, and even theological reasons for rejecting even this more benign form of Christian nationalism. So I want to be clear about that. I'm not in favor of any form of Christian nationalism, but the only thing reasonably called Christian nationalism in America today is not the sort of toxic stew described by Whitehead and Perry and other critics.
Okay, interesting. Well, who are the prominent defenders or promoters of Christian nationalism today? And what are the sorts of things that they're saying?
Yeah, thank you. So almost no one. In 2022, Marjorie Taylor Greene came out and embraced the concept. She said, "I am a proud Christian nationalist." She is to date the only elected member of Congress to do so. And that's somewhat telling. I was arguing with a friend from Georgetown about this, and he said, "What about Lauren Boebert?" And I said, "Well, where did she ever identify as a Christian nationalist?" And he goes, "Well, I don't know, but I'm sure she did." And so I took a step that anyone could take, really. I called up her congressional office, and I got to chat with her press secretary. And I said, "Does Representative Boebert, identify as a Christian nationalist?" And the press secretary said, "Absolutely not, because actual advocates of Christian nationalism want to deny women the right to vote, to say nothing of serving Congress. And of course she doesn't want the sitting member of Congress doesn't want to be associated with those sorts of ideas." So Marjorie Taylor Greene, only one, again, not really a thoughtful intellectual. I don't think she's out there making the case for it. In 2022, you also had Al Mohler and Doug Wilson, both at almost the same time, say, in effect, we aren't going to run from this label. It's salvageable. And so what they undertook to do was to redefine it. They wanted to make it crystal clear. We aren't conflating God and country. We aren't racist. We aren't militarist and this sort of thing. There's a reasonable way in which we can understand Christian nationalism. The way Wilson lays it out is not unreasonable. He says this: there's really three options in the world in which we live. We could live under one global government. and that sounds like a horrible idea. We could live in an international order of failed nation states where geographical areas are being run by mobs or tribes, and this is not a good alternative. Or we could live in an international order of nation states. I'm in favor of nation states, and therefore I'm a nationalist. Nation states, he goes on to say, are characterized by some sort of ideology. This could be fascism, it could be communism, it could be Islam, it could be atheism. My preferred ideology, for want of a better word, is Christianity. I want to live in a country characterized by Christianity. Therefore, I'm a Christian nationalist. Well, when you lay it out that way, that's a lot more reasonable. And Wilson goes on to make it crystal clear that in his understanding of Christian nationalism, religious minorities would be tolerated. They wouldn't be persecuted. It has no implications whatsoever, no negative implications with respect to race and gender and that sort of thing. But he hasn't spent a whole lot of time on it. So the three people that have spent the most time, there's a book by two fellows named Torbert and Isker arguing for Christian nationalism. Really, it's more of a pamphlet. It's probably 30 pages if you typed it out and double-spaced it. And it's mostly full of exhortations. It's interesting. They make it crystal clear. They do not think America was specially chosen by God. So what they write applies to any nation, according to them. They make it clear that their idea of Christian nationalism has nothing to do with racism whatsoever. They actually make it clear that it doesn't really have that much to do with the United States of America. They say, the chances of the United States of America becoming a Christian nation are almost non-existent. So the best we could hope for is Christian nationalism at the state level or the local level. So they aren't actually nationalists. And then what they do is they go on to encourage Christians to do lots of things that are not bad. You should be out there sharing the gospel. You should exercise. You should be wary of sending your kids to public schools. You should homeschool or send them to Christian schools, things like that. So this is not particularly a political project, right? When I reviewed the book, I called it the Protestant Benedict option, right? It's almost pulling away from public life. And then Stephen Wolfe, he has written the most substantive book to date, arguing for Christian nationalism, the case for Christian nationalism. Incidentally, Doug Wilson is involved in all of these projects. Doug Wilson's press, Canon Press, publishes Wolfe's book. Doug Wilson endorses the Torbert and Isker project. And then Doug Wilson, of course, has himself advocated for Christian nationalism or something like it. All these folks are basically quirky Calvinists. And I say this as an Anglican who's sympathetic to Calvinist theology. By quirky, I mean it's a distinctive brand of Calvinism that you wouldn't recognize at most PCA churches or OPC churches, the mainline Calvinist sort of churches. So in any case, Stephen Wolfe wrote a book, I believe, derived from his doctoral dissertation on 16th and 17th century Reformed political theology. And I think he gets these 16th and 17th century Reformed political theologians largely right. They did, in fact, believe that there should be a Christian prince who will favor true religion and who will punish heretics and who will be involved in the life of the community of the church and encouraging Christianity and Christian morality. Where he, I think, goes wrong is he says they were completely right and we should adopt what they were arguing for in the 16th and 17th century today, in the 21st century. On the other hand, I would point out that the Calvinist tradition has shifted. When the Presbyterians revised the Westminster Catechism in 1788 in Philadelphia, they got the government out of the business of calling church synods. The original standards allowed for that. The Presbyterians said, no, we don't want the government to be calling church synods. As well, 50 to 75% of American founders are reasonably labeled as Calvinists, and these Calvinists are coming to embrace a robust understanding of religious liberty for all, including the handful of non-Christians that are in America among Europeans, among Americans of European descent. And I'm speaking here of Jews, of 1,500 or so Jews in 4 or 5 American cities. I say of of European descent because it's real hard to know what's going on among enslaved populations or Native Americans. Clearly, they aren't all Christian, but of Americans of European descent, 98% Protestant, 2% Roman Catholic, handful of Jews. But nonetheless, we're moving towards a robust understanding of religious liberty, and appropriately so. So Wolfe, first of all, he makes it clear the United States of America is a failed nation. The cover of his book very much looks like he thinks the United States of America could become a Christian nation. It's an outline of the continental United States with a big cross over it and radiating throughout it. But he actually argues, if you bother to read the book, that the most we can hope for is that a Christian nation exists within the current boundaries of the United States of America. And so he talks about the possibility of a governor interpositioning himself from federal law and setting up perhaps a Christian nation in the state of Alabama, or maybe it would have to be within a county of Alabama, or a town in Alabama, or Idaho, or Louisiana. And so that's the best we can hope for. And within this Christian nation, and so there he's using nation in a very different way, we're going to have a prince, and I think he literally means a prince, one ruler, who will do things like, and he specifically says this, they will call church councils. This Christian prince will judge the outcome of the church councils. That is, do the ministers and bishops and whoever else attends, do they get it right? I don't know about you, but I do not want my political leaders judging what is appropriate Christian doctrine. As well, that this Christian prince will punish lazy ministers and enforce morality. And he will certainly disfavor, I think, in Wolf's case, everything other than Protestantism. So it's not clear that Catholics will be permitted within the Christian nation. It seems very likely that Jews and Muslims and others will not. Arch heretics, he writes, we don't necessarily have to kill them. We might just banish them instead. So this is not a very liberal project. It's a very illiberal project and a very ill-conceived one. I can see, and I run into young men who have gotten tired of what they perceive to be the cost of liberalism, political liberalism here. Drag queen story hours, pornography in elementary school libraries. It's mostly young men who say, what in the world are we doing? We need to be done with this. Liberalism has failed. And they are attracted to Stephen Wolf's Christian nationalism, or if they're Catholic, maybe a Catholic integralism. And I can understand the frustration, but I would just say, I think, especially in America, in an age in which Christians are going to be a minority in a pretty short time, liberalism actually has a lot to be said for it. Liberalism probably ends up protecting conservative Christians as much as anyone else. And I do think there's ways of addressing things like the drag queen story hours. Liberalism is not completely toothless. We could advocate for policies that say, for instance, that libraries can only have outside programming that goes alongside of its educational mission to get books into the hands of young people and that sort of thing. And therefore, it seems to me perfectly reasonable to say, even in this liberal regime, we can ban drag queen story hours and perhaps other things as well that are unhealthy for human flourishing.
Yeah, I noticed the same sort of thing. A lot of young men, and I myself as an example, I've definitely flirted with or been very interested. I'm still interested in, and I'm Catholic, so Catholic integralism is an interesting discussion, and as a sort of detached, abstract, philosophical, political sense. But then also when you're talking about something like Drag Queen Story Hour or the regime of butchering children and completely divorcing sex and gender, or saying that one or the other is fake, and that children should have rights totally separate from and against parents. So it's talking about the destruction of the family, of really what our civilization has meant for thousands of years. And we're told that we can't do these things, or this is the cost of doing democracy, or to oppose this is illiberal or anti-democratic. Then of course I think it makes sense to say, well, if this is liberalism, I'm all set. Before we get to your more critiques and your alternatives, I want to ask, I think, two related questions. What's the difference in your mind, besides the denominational one, between Christian nationalism and Catholic integralism as it plays out politically in terms of its political theology? Or is it more just denominational differences and sort of different crowds?
So I have mostly focused on the literature on Christian nationalism, and I've not really read deeply in the Catholic integralist literature. My understanding is maybe the ideal of the Catholic integralist would ultimately be to have a one world government in which the Pope plays a very significant role in telling the civic leaders, or monarch perhaps, what to do. And it's my understanding as well that it's similarly illiberal. It's not at all clear to me that Protestants would be tolerated within this one world Catholic global empire. Again, so for Protestants, I think they're much more happy to be localist, actually. The actual handful of people actually advocating for this really are advocating for it at the local level. And they, and again, yeah, the Protestantism. So I think it's not at all clear to me that Catholics would be tolerated within the Protestant Christian nation.
Gotcha. And then another theological question, just because I am Catholic, I don't have a very strong understanding of Protestant theology. One of the points in your book that you mentioned is the eschatological positions of people like Isker and Torba and Doug Wilson. Could you describe, you called it post-millennialism versus pre-millennialism. Can you just describe that distinction and how it is, I guess, upstream from the Christian Nationalist project?
Yes, I think these are critically important distinctions here. So eschatology refers to the study of the end times. And basically within Protestantism, I'm not sure how Catholics tend to think about this, but within American Protestantism, in the 19th century, most American Protestants were post-millennialist. And so they thought the kingdom of God is advancing on earth. More and more people will become Christians. And this is in the missionary movement and this sort of thing. Missionaries are going overseas. People are being converted. Protestantism is spreading. And not only will people become Christians, but society will become more and more Christian. And so we will, come up with better legislation. We will treat people better. We'll end slavery and things of this nature. And society will become a more godly place. Premillennial dispensationalism says, no, that's not the case. In fact, what's going to happen is things will get worse and worse and worse. And then eventually God will rapture the church. So all Christians on earth will be taken up to heaven. And then there will be a literal 7-year tribulation. And at the end of that tribulation, Christ will return finally and set up a millennial kingdom. So you can see how this premillennial dispensationalism is it's sort of grim, right? And it's hard to get excited about reforming society if you think things will get just worse and worse and worse. Premillennial dispensationalism exploded among American Protestants in the early 20th century, in part thanks to World War I, right? It sure looked like things were going really, really bad. And then a handful of other things that really made it seem like the world is going in a very grim direction. And so most American Protestants, at least, are premillennial dispensationalism. Doug Wilson, Torba and Isker, and a handful of these other advocates of Christian nationalism are post-millennialist. And so if you remember, this view is a view that the church is advancing, the kingdom of God is advancing. And you know this will happen because they're Calvinists, right? God in his sovereignty will bring this about. Even though things might not look like it's going this direction, God will bring it about. And so I think they're best understood as figuring out, okay, then what will these Christian societies look like? And so this is, Rushdoony was a postmillennialist, Doug Wilson clearly influenced by Rushdoony, Torben Isker as well. Now, it is the case that Stephen Wolfe, I always thought he was a post-millennialist, honestly, and I asked him about it point blank, and he refused to answer about a year or two ago. Recently, though, he has told me he's an amillennialist, and he denies completely that his eschatological views have anything to do with this project, and I take him at his word. But I think these distinctions are important because, again, there are precious few post-millennialists in America today, and those are the sort of people likely to be attracted to the Doug Wilson project. In fact, back when Rushdoony was kind of big in Christian intellectual circles anyway, two of Jerry Falwell's right-hand men wrote that his ideas would never be attractive to most evangelicals because of these eschatological differences. So I know this sounds very obscure, but if you're willing to take my word for it, it does matter a lot. And one of the things it shows is that there's not going to be much of an appetite for what I think Stephen Wolfe, Doug Wilson, Torben Isker are selling.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, like I said, I'm Catholic, so I don't know much about these sorts of theological things. I'm not even, in church we say Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. So I don't even think it'd be proper to say that we're pre-millennialists, but I don't think we have the sense that, Christ has already come, or that, I think we believe that through God's providence, he's advancing, through time, he's working in time and space, moving hearts, the power of the Holy Spirit in the church, various graces. But yeah, I think it's a very different discussion than what we have in the Catholic churches. So very interesting. I think with the remaining time we have, let's turn to some of your critiques, and really I'd be more interested in hearing some of your alternatives to Christian nationalism and how conservative Christians can participate in the public square, bring their faith into the public square without necessarily embracing Christian nationalism.
Yeah, thank you. So since 2006, Christian nationalism has almost always been used as a negative thing, as something that we need to critique or be scared of or be wary of. And again, mixed in with this idea of conflating God and country, which is wrong in and of itself, to conflate God and country, right? Christians have to recognize that we're citizens of two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and whatever country we live in. And, we're Americans, and so we're happy to be American citizens, but we cannot conflate God and country or citizenship in one with the other. And in the final analysis, if our country ever told us to do something that went against our faith, if Congress ordered us to bow down and worship Baal at 5 o'clock every day, we would have to say no. There are limits to our loyalty to our country. So the problem with Christian nationalism is it's been so associated with all these negative things. And to return to your point about young men, and you and me both, being upset with some things going on in society today, such as mutilation of children, pornography in elementary schools, and this sort of thing, if we say, well, we're so sick of this that we're going to embrace Christian nationalism and we'll try to bring about Christian nationalism to fix these problems, well, this is going to be really scary to most people, right? Even many Christians. They don't want this sort of racist, sexist, at least what they perceive to be a racist, sexist, favoring white men above all others. And so it's just incredibly imprudent. And I understand the actual advocates go out of their way to say we aren't racist, we aren't sexist, but you're still fighting with all that baggage. So here's my approach. I would say let's dump that label altogether and just say, look, I'm a Christian who's involved in politics. And I have a variety of views that I'm going to argue for in the public square, and I'm going to argue for them in the way that is most likely to be effective. And so if I'm arguing before a church convention, I may very well make biblical arguments or theological arguments. But if I'm in the public square and we are debating how to deal with young boys, and I mean literally boys, an 8-year-old boy who thinks he's a girl, how should we think about this? Well, I think here, if we're debating this in the public square, we probably don't want to refer to the Bible or Christian theology. We could refer to what we now know is happening. There's psychological things going on, that children sometimes have these views and then they grow out of them or they change. We could talk about what the progressive European countries are doing, who were ahead of us in permitting these surgeries and now are rapidly pulling away because they're recognizing that they're scarring people for life in ways that cannot be easily altered. And so we attempt to build a coalition. And it's possible then perhaps that you and I as Christians could team up with our Muslim neighbors and team up with our sensible secular neighbors and build a coalition that could then pass restrictions on mutilating children and letting children engage in gender mutilating surgery. And similarly with respect to sex education that goes way beyond the pale, and I'm not against some forms of sex education, but recently in Montgomery County, Maryland, they were doing some really pretty explicit sexual education type stuff. And for a while, they were allowing parents to opt out of it. Then they stopped doing this. And this led to a variety of protests from Muslim citizens of Montgomery County. And so here's something where I think we could, build a coalition. Again, concerned Christians, Catholics and Protestants alike, Muslims, Sikhs, Jews, atheists, who can come together and say, look, we aren't against sex education, but certain things should be left to the family, right? And so, I think so if I can speak explicitly as a Christian, I think it's entirely proper to be motivated by my faith, by things my faith tell me are true, to advocate for those things in the public square. We have to recognize just practically we live in a country where only about 64% of the people identify as Christians, and probably a decent percentage of those never darken the door of a church. And I don't mean that critically, just their Christian faith isn't all that important to them perhaps. And so it simply is not the case that there's a large Christian majority that can impose its view on the nation. Even if there was, I'm not saying we should do that, But practically, if we want to achieve protection of innocent human life, a robust understanding of religious liberty, if we want to get things like school vouchers as alternatives to public schools, we need to build coalitions. And calling ourselves Christian nationalists is just counterproductive to that.
That makes sense. I'm curious also how your scholarly work, if you could turn to the founding, what models, what historical examples or instances of policies or things that happened historically of intersections between church and state, while still recognizing they're different. But historically, when you look, there's a lot more overlap than there is today. So what sorts of things historically might we look to return to or bring about again in our current situation versus things that we can leave in our past, do you think?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So it lets me reference two of my earlier books. First of all, let me affirm a proper understanding of the separation of church and state. These are two separate institutions, and we never want the church running the government or the government running the church. Jesus said, given to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Galatius came up with this two swords doctrine. I think it's very important to recognize these two are separate institutions. So in my book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? One of the things I argue is that America's founders were influenced by their Christian faith or by ideas developed within the Christian tradition of political reflection. And I give a number of specific examples of this, just to mention two right now. One is America's founders were convinced that humans were sinful. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And even Christians continue to struggle with the old man within. And so therefore, they went in the exact opposite direction of where Enlightenment political thought was going. Enlightenment political thought going to a centralized government of the experts. America's founders would have nothing of that. So they embraced federalism, where the national government has very limited powers, Article 1, Section 8 powers. And then within the national government, they divided power, right? Separation of powers and checks and balances. And we can see Madison's great discussion of this in Federalist 51. If men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. But men aren't angels, so we need government, and yet we need to be wary of concentrated powers. And he goes on to defend the sorts of things I've been talking about. Secondly, America's founders, by the time we get to the founding, America's founders had come to understand that religious liberty of all citizens must be robustly protected and that citizens shouldn't be discriminated against on the basis of religion. And so in Article 6, we ban religious tests for office, for federal office. Now, anti-federalists objected, wait a minute, this means a Jew or a Muslim or an atheist could hold federal office, could even be president of the United States. And the Federalists had to admit that this was a possibility. They usually would go on to say, but it will never happen. And in a country that was basically 99.99% Christian, it did seem very unlikely to them, of course. As well, one of my favorite letters from this era is George Washington's letter to the Hebrew Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. Remember, there's only about 1,500 Jews in America, and they don't have political or economic power. But he was crystal clear that Jews, just as much as Catholics, just as much as Protestants, have a right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience and, to paraphrase, to act upon their religious convictions whenever possible. And so these are ideas that I think come out of the Christian tradition. They're not always respected. And of course, as you know, there's a profound anti-Catholicism in the 19th century that's very regrettable. That goes against the principles of the founding, I would argue. In my last book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, I show a number of ways that Christians have been involved in politics to advocate for things that we now understand to be very, very good. This includes founders that worked against slavery. Slavery was banned or put on the road to extinction in 8 northern mid-Atlantic states. Slavery was prohibited in the Northwest Old Northwest. They were motivated by their Christian faith to take significant steps to end slavery. Of course, the invention of the cotton gin sort of ruined that trend in the American South. But what did Christians do in the 19th century? They had an abolitionist movement where they were motivated by their faith to end this evil, horrible institution. And I don't talk about it, but we could talk about about, I don't talk about it in that book, but we could talk about the modern civil rights movement led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, Thomas Young, and others. So yeah, you could point to, there's a bazillion ways in which Christians have been appropriately involved in political activity for ends that we now see as good. Now, obviously, something like pro-life activism today is not going to be seen as an unequivocal good by a majority of Americans, probably not the vast majority, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. I think the early abolitionists were a minority, and they were right, and they fought the good fight, and eventually they ended slavery. And so today, I think we have an obligation, those of us who believe in the sanctity of human life, and have an obligation to engage in political activity to place limits upon the ability of people to end in pregnancies with violence.
Absolutely. I've got one more question for you, not necessarily related to the book, but with the work that you do on religious liberty in the states with the CRCD. The Supreme Court in recent years has been much more favorable to religious liberty than it had been maybe in the 60s, maybe 50s through the 90s. So in the last 15, 20 years, especially in the last few years, with the construction of the court, or the makeup of the court. Recently, they handed down a great victory in Bremerton, which I think allowed school vouchers for religious schools, which had not been the law prior. So what are the sorts of things that you think we, as advocates of religious liberty and religious freedom, should be focusing on? What are some of the test cases or live issues happening in the sort of jurisprudence today and things like that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. You're right. The court has gotten better protecting religious liberty. The court is still operating under a decision that was made in 1990, Employment Division versus Smith, which said that the free exercise clause of the First Amendment simply requires laws to be neutral and of general applicability. As long as they're that, even if they keep people from acting on their religious convictions, they're okay. They're constitutionally okay. This case came out of the great state of Oregon, my former home, where Oregon said nobody gets to use peyote, period. Now you have Native Americans who say, but we need to use peyote in our religious ceremonies. And Oregon said, sorry, the law is the law. You don't get to do it. The U.S. Supreme Court threw out an earlier test that was developed in 1963, which said the government can only keep you from acting on your religious conviction if there's a compelling reason to do so, and if the government is achieving its aim in the least intrusive way. And so that test probably would have protected the ability of Native Americans to use peyote, but the new test, as long as something is neutral and of general applicability, it's constitutional under the First Amendment. And this means states have a lot of freedom to protect or not to protect religious liberty. There are some federal statutes, a Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act, which requires some protections, but there's still many, many ways states can choose to protect or not religious liberty. And so beginning in 2022, the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy started coming out with a ranking system where it ranked the states. How well do states do protecting religious liberty or not? We began, I think it was with something like 28 specific protections. Those were expanded to 34, and I've now taken over as director of this project. And so in the summer of 2024, we'll come out with, it's called Religious Liberty in the States 2024, with a new set of rankings based on 39 distinct ways states could protect religious liberty or not. We make all of our findings available online. We provide links to all of the statutes, so it's completely transparent. So let me just give you one example of one of the measures we use. I think it's a pretty important measure, and as a Catholic, I'm sure you will agree. So a number of states have expanded who are mandatory reporters, who have to report to the state when they hear allegations or they hear someone talking about sexual assault of anyone, really, but let's especially focus in on children, sexual assault of children. Well, these are in general good laws, and I support them, right? And so if a teacher overhears or sees something along these lines, she has to report it. Same with the nurse, same with the doctor. Unfortunately, some of these statutes expanding it to literally every adult in the state, by definition, would include clergy. ministers of the gospel, Catholic priests. And the problem here comes not so much if a Catholic priest was walking by a house and he saw someone sexually assaulting a child or something. I think the Catholic priest could in good conscience go and report this. The problem comes what if someone comes to the confessional and confesses to the priest that he's done this sort of thing. According to Roman Catholic theology, as I understand it, ecclesiastical law, the priest cannot break the seal of the confession. The punishment for it is automatic excommunication. So if a priest were to do this, it's such a serious offense, he would be excommunicating himself. So as you can imagine, Catholic priests wouldn't break the seal of the confession. So many states specifically protect the different classes of people from having to report sexual assault or that sort of thing. Interestingly, literally every state protects attorneys, right? Attorney-client privilege. So if someone comes to you and hires your services as an attorney to defend you against sexual assault, that attorney can never be forced to testify against his client. Many states do that with respect to clergy. Some states don't. And so it's our hope that the states that don't have certain religious liberty protections will embrace them. And so one of the things I do in my spare time is I'll talk to any legislator or state policy council that will listen to me, and I'll suggest to them, well, your state does real good on these 19 items, but here are 5 things you should really consider perhaps proposing in the state legislature. And by the way, we aren't just making this up out of thin air. Here are actual protections in other states that do this already. Not that you would necessarily copy those protections uncritically, but at least it's a good place to start. You don't have to start writing the legislation from scratch.
That sounds like a fascinating project. You can let the states compete with each other, all to the benefit of religious liberty and religious people everywhere. Mark, the book is Who's Afraid of Christian Nationalism? Thanks for speaking with me about it. And I encourage all of our readers to go buy and read the book. I read it in about a day. It was it was a page turner, very interesting. Besides that book, besides the 2 other books that you mentioned and this Religious Liberty in the States project, what are the things which you recommend to our listeners?
Well, to be selfish, my wife has built me a really nice website, markdavidhall.org. And if you go there, you can find information about the 3 books we've referenced thus far and all of my scholarly works, including a book with ISI Press, which is one of my favorite books. I did it with Gary Gregg at the McConnell Center, America's Forgotten Founders. And so you can go there and look at other good work, other work at least by me, and I'd encourage you to do that. Within most of my books, what I do is I reference other books that should be read. So in Did America Have a Christian Founding, I end every chapter with 4 or 5 books for further reading. And so I certainly don't pretend to have a monopoly on truth. There's lots of good works out there on religious liberty, church-state relations, the American founding. Not so many on Christian nationalism, but hopefully there'll be more in the future.
Excellent. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.